My grandfather looked me dead in the eye, smiled like it was a secret between us, and asked, "How's the apartment I gave you last month?" I blinked. I laughed. I said, "What apartment?" He stopped smiling. We were sitting at Sunday brunch with the whole family. Robert, Chloe, my mother, the aunts, everyone. And suddenly the room got real quiet. My father dropped his fork. Chloe looked like she'd seen a ghost. That's when I knew. Something had been stolen. From me. And not just a property or a gift, but a piece of love meant for me. A legacy. A truth. My grandfather reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a wrinkled envelope. Inside was a copy of the deed. My name. My signature. All forged. He stared at my father. "Why did you do this to her?" And my father just said without a blink, "Because she was never supposed to have it." That was the moment everything shattered. That was the moment I realized I wasn't fighting for an apartment. I was fighting for the right to exist in this family. My name is Sophie Miller, and I used to think staying silent would keep the peace. But silence only protected the ones who broke me. Before I share my story, I want to know you're here with me. Say listening in the comments or tell me where you're from. I love seeing how far a story can travel, especially one that almost got buried. And if you believe stories like mine deserve to be told, please subscribe. It means more than you know. Thank you. And now, here's everything. Sunday brunch at the Capitol Grill was supposed to be celebratory. I had just graduated after all. But as I sat at the end of the polished mahogany table, my thrifted dress stiff at the seams and my voice nowhere to be found, I knew this wasn't a celebration. Not for me. It was a performance. One that my family had mastered complete, with rehearsed smiles and scripted questions. Mom Linda was nodding along to something my sister Chloe said, her pearl earrings catching the chandelier light like stage props. Dad Robert checked his watch every 5 minutes, sipping his overpriced Bloody Mary with the bored grace of someone who already had somewhere better to be. Chloe barely looked up from her phone, the screen glow reflecting in her perfectly curled lashes. And then there was my grandfather, George Miller, sharp suit, steady eyes, and the only one at the table who actually saw me. The server had just cleared the appetizers when he turned to me with a gentle smile. "So, Sophie," he said, setting down his coffee cup. "How's the apartment? The one I bought you last month. You settling in? Okay." Time didn't stop, it shattered. My fork hovered mid-air. My breath caught somewhere between my chest and throat. What apartment?" I asked, blinking, my voice a thread of confusion. He tilted his head slightly. "The apartment. In Lodo. I sent the money to your father weeks ago. Thought you'd moved in after graduation." I laughed short and sharp, but no one joined me. "I still live in the basement unit off Blake Street," I said louder now. "With the busted radiator, no windows, and that neighbor who smokes weed through a straw. I've never even heard of an apartment in Lodo." That's when the silence snapped. Mom looked at me like I'd just spoken in another language. Chloe's phone froze in her hand. And Dad, he dropped his fork. It hit the porcelain plate with a crack so clear the entire room seemed to exhale at once. For a long moment, nobody said a word. I filled the void. I'm still paying rent every week to a landlord who yells through the wall instead of knocking. I have to work double shifts just to keep the lights on. I haven't received a dime, not a dime, from this family since college started. So whatever apartment you think I live in, Grandpa, I promise you I've never even seen it." The warmth drained from the room. The brunch that was meant to honor me now sat cold and congealed on fine china. I could feel them all staring at me, but no one moved to speak. I wasn't screaming, I wasn't accusing, I was just done pretending. I looked at each of them one by one, searching their eyes for some sign that what I was saying meant anything. Then, absurdly, a thought crept in, half angry, half sardonic. If this were a Reddit revenge story, someone in the comments would already be typing, "OP needs to cut contact." And suddenly I wanted to be anywhere else but here. The silence sat heavier than any accusation. It wasn't disbelief, it was exposure. I sat frozen in my chair, my pulse in my throat, the air conditioning cold against my skin despite the summer heat outside. Grandpa leaned slightly toward me. His voice was softer now, but laced with something I hadn't heard from him in years' suspicion. I transferred $50,000, he said, not looking at anyone but me. Right after your graduation. I told Robert to use it to get you a place. Something decent. Safe. Something you deserve. My chest tightened. I never heard about it, I replied. Not once. Then finally, movement. Mom turned to Dad, her voice low but trembling. Robert, when did you say anything to me about this? He waved a hand almost dismissively. She's probably confused. I mean, Dad did mention something about wanting to help, but there wasn't anything formal. Chloe rolled her eyes and gave a mocking laugh. God, Sophie, are you serious? You always do this, make everything a scene. A flush burned beneath my skin, but my voice stayed calm. I wasn't spiraling. I was finally speaking. If this is a misunderstanding, I said slowly, then why am I still living in a windowless basement while the rest of you think I have a condo downtown? My grandfather's eyes snapped to my father. You took the money, he said flatly. You said you'd handle it. You didn't. So where is it? Robert's mouth opened, then closed. He didn't answer. Mom reached for her napkin, dabbing the corners of her mouth with a tremble I hadn't seen before. Her eyes, still fixed on my father, started to glisten. And then something shifted in me. It was a small click, like a lock unlatching. I realized I didn't owe this family an explanation anymore. I didn't have to stand there and perform pain for them to believe it was real. I stood up slowly, letting my chair slide back with a controlled scrape. You know what I said? I'm not doing this. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I'm part of a family that only works if I play silent and stupid. Grandpa started to rise, but I held up a hand. No, Grandpa. Thank you. But I need air. I turned and walked away from the table through the clatter of cutlery and the quiet stares from nearby diners who had been pretending not to listen. As I reached the door, I didn't look back. The act was over. The brunch, the pleasantries, the smiling portraits of what we were supposed to be, it was all a hollow performance built on silence. And for the first time in my life, I had walked off that stage. It didn't feel like rebellion. It felt like truth. And maybe that was the most radical thing I'd ever done. Later that afternoon, my phone rang. Grandpa's name lit up the screen, and before I could say hello, his voice came through steady but quieter than usual. Let me see where you live, Sophie. So I met him at the edge of the alley near Blake Street, where the sidewalks cracked and the smell of weed and garbage lingered no matter the season. He parked his black sedan at the curb, got out slowly, and looked around the neighborhood with a gaze that didn't need words. I led him down the narrow, uneven steps that dipped below street level into the basement unit I called home. The bulb above the door flickered once, then went dark completely. I jiggled the handle and pushed open the door. The smell hit us first. Stale cigarettes, damp carpet, something faintly metallic like rusted pipes. Inside the room revealed itself in layers of resignation. Second-hand furniture, mismatched and sagging. A single bed pushed up against the wall 2 feet from the vibrating hum of the washer and dryer unit. One window-sized vent that didn't open, yellow stains along the ceiling. My suitcase still sitting half-packed in the corner from when I had first moved in and never bothered to unpack fully. Grandpa didn't say anything for a long time. He stepped into the room, looked around, and slowly sat on the edge of my bed. His hands rested on his knees. He leaned forward, breathing through his nose like he didn't trust the air. I stood in the middle of the room, arms crossed, heart pounding. I didn't know what I was expecting him to say. I only knew I had never let anyone from the family see this place. And now he was sitting in it, quiet and real. When he finally spoke, his voice was so soft I almost missed the first sentence. Robert did something like this before. I turned toward him, uncertain I'd heard correctly. When Chloe was little, he continued. He drained her college fund. Your grandmother found out. We fought about it for weeks. He promised he'd make it right. We never told her. My mouth went dry. I sank onto the arm of the faded recliner across from him. He stole from Chloe, I asked. Grandpa nodded once. And now from you. You're not the first, but you need to be the last. For the first time since this whole thing started, I saw something in his expression that wasn't disappointment. It was regret. A deep, buried kind of sorrow. I let him get away with it once, he said. I won't let it happen again. He straightened his back, voice firmer now. Tomorrow morning, we go to the bank. And then we go to the lawyer. This ends now. I nodded, swallowing hard, my throat aching like I'd been holding back tears all day without knowing. He looked around again at the chipped walls, the taped-up vents, the crate I used as a nightstand. Then he turned back to me and said quietly, You should never have had to live like this. He didn't mean just the room. That night after he left, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling fan that never worked. I thought about all the times I had convinced myself I was overreacting, that maybe I was the problem, that Dad's coldness was just old-fashioned parenting, that Chloe deserved better because she was easier to love. But now I knew better. What Dad did wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern, a strategy. Something he calculated and kept quiet until the paper trail forced it into daylight. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't bitter. I was telling the truth. And starting tomorrow, the truth was going to get very, very loud. The next morning, Denver wore its usual disguise, blue sky coffee shops, buzzing streets filled with joggers and bike commuters pretending life was orderly. But inside the downtown branch of Union First Bank, everything felt hollow and cold. I wore the only clean blouse I had, still wrinkled from yesterday. Grandpa looked like he was headed to court, full suit, silver cufflinks, leather gloves tucked under one arm. But his face held none of the usual calm. His jaw was tight, his eyes sharp. The banker, mid-30s, too cheerful, greeted him with a smile that quickly faded when he saw the name George Miller on the paperwork and the steel in Grandpa's voice. I'd like a full transaction record for a transfer made in June, Grandpa said. 50,000. Recipient Robert Miller. She typed, clicked, and paused, then printed. Page after page came out of the machine in quick spits. She slid them across the desk. I leaned in. My name was right there, typed under the memo line for Sophie's condo. But just 3 days later, a withdrawal. 50,000. Destination, a private investment account. Same name. No mention of real estate. No note. Just gone. Grandpa picked up the document slowly, his mouth set in a thin, grim line. I want these notarized and sealed. The banker nodded. No questions asked. She knew better. I stared at the papers. It wasn't a hunch anymore. It wasn't a family misunderstanding. It was theft. Dad's words echoed in my head. Don't expect anyone to save you. He hadn't just believed that. He had lived it, profited from it, at my expense. Later that afternoon, we drove to the house I grew up in. Highlands. Front lawn still trimmed like a brochure photo. Same porch swing, same driveway, same lie. Grandpa parked in the driveway without ringing the bell. I clutched the envelope in my lap, the seal still warm from the notary. Inside, Mom and Dad stood in the living room like they were expecting us. Chloe lingered behind them, arms crossed. Grandpa didn't sit. He went straight to the point. Robert read this. He handed over a document, one he had already prepared with his attorney. A statement of acknowledgement, a demand for restitution, a complete severance of financial authority. Dad looked down, skimmed the first lines, and scoffed. You've got to be kidding. You're actually taking her side. I'm taking the side of the facts, Grandpa said, calm but absolute. Mom stood nearby, her hands wringing a dish towel she wasn't even holding. Chloe's face was unreadable. Dad finally began to read out loud. I, Robert Miller, acknowledge receipt of funds intended for the purchase of a residence for my daughter, Sophie Miller. His voice faltered as he reached the second paragraph, and further acknowledged that these funds were not used for their intended purpose. When he stopped, the silence in the room wasn't just uncomfortable, it was deafening. I stood beside Grandpa, suddenly aware of how steady my breathing was. For once, I wasn't the one trembling. Dad folded the document and set it on the coffee table. Fine. If this is what you want. Congratulations. You've won. Mom didn't meet my eyes. Chloe didn't move. Grandpa turned to face them all. From this day forward, Robert has no authority over any of my accounts or estate. Everything will be handled legally, transparently. Sophie will not be left behind again. Nobody argued. I walked out of that house not feeling victorious, but unburdened. The childhood home I once longed to return to no longer had any power over me. It wasn't a place anymore. It was just a container for silence. And I wasn't going to be silent again. A week had passed since the confrontation in my childhood home, but the weight of it hadn't eased. I'd thought that seeing my father forced to read his own betrayal aloud would offer some form of peace, or at the very least clarity. But instead, it left behind a quieter ache, an echo that settled in my chest and made everything else feel muted. That morning, I found a letter slipped through the mail slot of my apartment door. The handwriting on the envelope was familiar, delicate, deliberate. My mother's. Inside was a short note asking me to meet her for tea at a small cafe tucked along the edge of Capitol Hill. She wrote that she wanted to speak in private, away from everyone else, away from eyes and ears and obligations. I almost didn't go. But curiosity, or maybe guilt, pulled me there anyway. The cafe was as pristine as I remembered it. White tablecloths, fresh-cut flowers in little glass vases, the sound of clinking spoons and murmured conversation. She was already seated when I arrived, wearing a pale blue cardigan I hadn't seen in years, the one she used to wrap around herself when the house got cold in winter. Her hands were wrapped around a teacup, moving it gently in slow circles, as though she were stirring something that didn't exist. "Hi, Mom," I said, slipping into the chair across from her. She looked up. Her face held a tired softness that I almost didn't recognize. "You look thinner," she said. "Are you eating enough?" I didn't answer. We both knew that wasn't the real reason she asked me here. She sighed and placed the teacup down. "I didn't know what to do, Sophie. This whole thing, it's getting out of control." I stayed silent, waiting. Robert's being talked about. At church, among friends, people are saying things, and Chloe's upset. She thinks you're trying to ruin us. "I'm not trying to ruin anyone," I said calmly. "I'm just not lying anymore." She hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "Maybe it's time to consider moving past this." "We all make mistakes, honey." "Mistake," I repeated, stunned. "You call stealing $50,000 from your own daughter a mistake?" "I'm not saying it was right," she replied quickly. "But he's still your father, and this is tearing the family apart. Do you really want that on your hands?" I stared at her, stunned that even now, after all of it, she was asking me to carry the weight of his choices. "I'm not the one who tore anything apart," I said, my voice trembling now. "I'm just the one who stopped pretending." Her eyes dropped. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then she slid a small folded paper across the table, a handwritten invitation. "Your aunt and uncle are hosting a little get-together at Wash Park this weekend. Just close family, a chance to clear the air. Please come." For me. I shouldn't have gone, but I did. Wash Park was where we used to picnic when I was younger. Birthday parties, Easter Sundays, even one disastrous Thanksgiving when Dad forgot the turkey. It had always felt like neutral ground. But as I walked up to the rented gazebo near the lake, the air felt charged, brittle like thin ice. Everyone was already there, my parents, Chloe, both of my uncles and their wives, and even two cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. The moment I approached, the conversation dimmed. Dad stood and turned to face me. "I think it's time we all had a real talk," he began. "There's been a lot of accusations lately, lies, manipulations, and I think we all need to understand who's really behind them." He looked straight at me. "Sophie has been feeding Grandpa stories, twisting facts, turning him against his own son for her own gain." I didn't move. I just stared back at him. He continued. "She's made herself out to be some kind of victim, but she's always had a flair for drama, ever since she was little." Chloe stepped forward. "Don't act surprised," she said, arms crossed. "You've always resented me. You used to throw tantrums whenever I got something you didn't. Admit it, you've always been jealous." The words hit harder than I expected, not because they were true, but because Chloe believed them. I opened my mouth to respond, but my aunt cut in. "George," she said, turning to Grandpa, "are you sure you're not being misled here? I mean, this is a lot of responsibility you're handing over. Are you sure this isn't just Sophie using you to settle old scores?" I looked at my grandfather standing alone in a circle of skepticism. His shoulders stiffened. His mouth opened slightly, but he didn't speak right away. That's when I realized this wasn't a reconciliation. This was a trial. And I was the accused. With no defense attorney, no jury, no allies, just silence. I felt the burn rise in my throat before I could stop it. "If protecting myself makes me selfish," I said, my voice shaking, "then maybe I've been too selfless for too long." No one said a word. So I turned and walked out. This time no one followed. I didn't look back. The sun was setting behind the lake. As I stepped past the playground, the sound of children laughing far off behind me. I didn't cry until I reached the sidewalk, and even then I didn't wipe my tears away. I let them fall, let them be seen, because for once I wasn't hiding. The new apartment in Lodo was modern, clean, and for the first time in a long while, quiet. Too quiet. 2 weeks had passed since the ambush at Wash Park, and I still couldn't shake the feeling that I was waiting for something. For what? I wasn't sure. Redemption. A phone call. Closure. Instead, what I got was a screen full of poison. It started with a buzz, then another. I rolled over in bed and checked my phone. Chloe had posted a photo. It was a family brunch cropped, so I was conveniently missing. The caption read, "Family is where you don't have to worry about gold diggers." I froze. Within minutes, the comments rolled in. Some subtle, some cruel. Others tagged me directly. Guess Sophie's basement wasn't enough. First, she plays the poor card, now she's moving into Grandpa's bank account. Queen of manipulation strikes again. Even old classmates joined in, people I hadn't spoken to since sophomore year. Photos of me from college reappeared in mocking memes. I dropped the phone. Not because I was surprised, because I finally understood that the truth didn't matter to people who'd already chosen their version of me. I didn't cry right away. I sat on the floor of my living room, my back against the kitchen counter, staring at the blank wall across from me. I had fought so hard to keep the family's name out of the dirt. I had protected them even when they didn't deserve it. And now the silence I gave them had been weaponized and turned back on me. Later that evening, I went to Grandpa's house to retrieve a folder I had left in his office. While he napped, I searched the drawers for it. In one cabinet behind a stack of old tax documents, I found a small wooden box. It looked older than anything else in the room. Inside were letters. Dozens of them, each addressed to my grandmother. Most were dated long before I was born. I hesitated, then opened one. It was filled with tenderness, regret, hopes for forgiveness. Then I found one marked Robert. I opened it carefully. In it, Grandpa wrote about discovering that my father had emptied Chloe's college fund in 2007. He'd been devastated, had confronted him. Robert had promised to return the money, had sworn it would never happen again. Grandpa had chosen to believe him. He ended the letter with a single line, "I wanted to believe he could be better. But belief without action is just cowardice." I sat back in the chair, letter trembling in my hands. This had happened before. It wasn't just me, it wasn't new. My father had stolen from Chloe too, and Grandpa had kept it quiet, had hoped silence would heal what truth should have burned clean. I understood now. This wasn't just about inheritance, it wasn't about favoritism or revenge. It was about breaking a cycle that had been allowed to fester for years. I put the letter back carefully, locked the box, and tucked it beneath my arm. That night I called Grandpa. "I'll be at brunch Sunday," I said. He paused. "Are you sure I'm not coming to eat?" I said. "I'm coming to speak. And this time I'm bringing everything." The table was longer than I remembered, and the chandelier above it cast a yellow warmth over a brunch that had gone ice cold before the first fork was raised. This was the Capitol Grill once again. But this Sunday, the familiar rituals, the handshakes, the scripted greetings, the performative clinking of glasses had been replaced with an expectant, almost brittle silence. I wore a fitted black blazer, my hair pulled back tight, my bag heavier than usual, not because of its weight, but because of what it carried. Documents, letters, receipts, truth. Around the table sat the same constellation of people, only the gravity had shifted. Grandpa sat at the head, his face unreadable. My father, Robert, 2 seats away, stared straight ahead. My mother, Linda, looked everywhere but at me. Chloe sat to their right, arms folded tightly across her chest. My aunt and uncle were there too, their expressions tense with a polite detachment that had always annoyed me, and a few cousins, clearly uncomfortable, stirred their drinks in silence. I cleared my throat. I'd like to say something. No one objected. I placed the stack of documents in the center of the table and pulled out a folded piece of paper, one of Grandpa's letters to my grandmother. I read aloud. "Robert took money from Chloe's college fund. He promised to change. He did not change." For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then my mother gasped softly and pressed her fingers to her lips. Chloe's face lost its color. Someone knocked over a water glass, the clatter of ice the only sound in the room. Before I could continue, my father pushed back his chair. "This is ridiculous," he said, standing. "George isn't of sound mind. He hasn't been for a while. I've already spoken to a lawyer. Everything he's signed recently should be reconsidered. Legally." He nodded toward the door. A man in a charcoal suit entered carrying a folder. He introduced himself as legal counsel, then laid a formal request for psychological evaluation on the table. Grandpa didn't flinch, but I could feel the heat rising in my chest. "If Grandpa is unfit," I said evenly, "why have you been accepting money from him for years? Why is it only now when he refuses to let you control things that you question his mind?" No one answered. I opened a second letter and began reading. It was a memo Grandpa had written 2 years ago to his attorney. In it, he detailed his growing concern over Robert's financial behavior. He requested a gradual transfer of authority over his assets to a third party with specific instructions to monitor withdrawals linked to family members. Chloe leaned forward slightly, her expression unreadable. My mother sat frozen, tears forming but not falling. Without a word, Grandpa reached into his coat and pulled out a thick envelope. He placed it on the table. "This is my final amendment," he said. "It's been notarized and certified. Sophie and Chloe are the primary beneficiaries. But only under one condition: mutual responsibility. No one inherits anything alone. You two must choose to work together or walk away with nothing." He looked at both of us. "This isn't about money. It never was. This is about character, about whether you two can become better than the people who failed you." Silence stretched across the table like a sheet of glass. I looked at Chloe. She wouldn't meet my eyes. The light from the chandelier gleamed off the stack of documents. I felt like I was standing in a courtroom, not a restaurant. Every fork and knife was a gavel, every gaze a verdict. But I wasn't there to win. I was there to speak. When it was over, I gathered my things. My hands were shaking. My heartbeat echoed in my ears. As I stepped into the Denver sunlight outside, I didn't feel victorious. I felt exposed. exhausted. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just a guest at the table. I had become the one who said it. A week later, I was standing in a shell of a room, no windows, peeling walls, bare concrete floor. It was part of an old public housing project in North Denver, now up for redevelopment. I was there as the lead designer on a community housing initiative for low-income families. The air was thick with dust and memory. The space reminded me of the basement I had called home not long ago. The same lack of light, the same quiet neglect. Only this time, I wasn't the one moving in, I was redesigning it. I took out my sketchbook and started drawing. Natural light tunnels, multi-purpose wall storage, built-in seating that converted into beds. I wrote a note at the top, design inspired by a basement that taught me how to survive. When I presented the concept, the board nodded thoughtfully. One man leaned back in his chair, tapped the folder and said, "It's personal. That's why it works." And just like that, the project moved forward. That night, while refining floor plans at my kitchen table, I heard a knock on the door. I opened it to find Chloe standing there wearing a hoodie and no makeup. She looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe just quieter. She didn't speak right away, just handed me a sealed envelope, her hands shaking. Inside was a short letter written in Chloe's unmistakable neat cursive. "I know you don't believe me, and maybe you shouldn't, but I went through Dad's financials. There's more. He's been hiding things for years, from all of us. I've cut contact. I'm sorry I didn't believe you when it mattered." I looked up at her. She didn't smile. She didn't beg. I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around her. For a moment, we just stood there in the doorway. Two people who had grown up in the same house, raised by the same man, but had only just begun to understand each other. We cried. Neither of us said it out loud, but we both knew it wasn't just about this moment. It was about everything that had led here. A few days later, my mother showed up. She looked tired. Not sick, just worn down by something more emotional than physical. She asked if she could sit. "I started therapy," she said, "last week. For the first time in my life. I didn't say anything. I wasn't ready to forgive. But I was ready to listen. I let the silence swallow us all," she whispered. "I didn't protect you. And I let him believe it was okay to keep hurting you. I was wrong." She didn't ask for forgiveness. She asked for a second chance. That weekend, Grandpa hosted a small brunch at his home in Cherry Creek. Just four of us, me, Chloe, Mom, and him. No cousins, no whispers, no accusations. Just a quiet meal with coffee and eggs, and the sound of leaves brushing against the windows. He handed us each a copy of the new will. The clause about reconciliation had been replaced. It now read, "This inheritance is not conditional on harmony, but I hope you'll choose to build something with it." When brunch ended, I lingered at the table watching the sunlight stream through the dining room windows. Everything felt different, but not dramatic. There was no music swelling in the background, no sudden declaration of healing, just peace. The kind that isn't loud, the kind that comes when the lies have finally stopped echoing. As I walked to the front door, I paused and turned back. "I'm still angry," I said. "But I'm not going to let that anger decide who I become." Chloe nodded. My mother exhaled a quiet breath of something that might have been relief. Outside, the neighborhood shimmered in the amber glow of late afternoon. I sat on the porch steps a while, letting the warmth soak into my skin. No one would ever shove me back into the dark again. Not physically, not emotionally. I had lived in a basement. Now I built homes filled with light. 3 weeks had passed since our quiet brunch in Cherry Creek. Life moved forward, but the ache inside me didn't dissolve with it. I was busy every day meeting contractors, sketching designs, coordinating permits for the Harper Court redevelopment, but in the stillness of night, I still heard his voice. My father's voice. Cold. Cutting. Impossible to scrub out no matter how much light I tried to build into the spaces I created. One late afternoon, as the sky turned orange above the rooftops of Lodo, I received a call from Grandpa. His voice was softer than usual, as though he'd used most of his strength just to say my name. "Can you come by?" he asked. "There's something I need to give you." When I arrived, he was sitting in his favorite chair near the window, a blanket folded neatly over his knees. His frame seemed smaller, his skin thinner, but his eyes still carried that fierce clarity I had clung to through the darkest moments. He handed me a sealed envelope. "This is my last letter," he said. "After this, I don't want either of us to carry the ghosts." I sat beside him carefully, opening the flap. Inside was a handwritten letter dated just a few days prior. It was longer than his usual notes and written in the same steady cursive I'd come to recognize as a map of truth. He wrote of my father's early years, his brilliance, his promise, and then the disappointments. The small betrayals that grew into bigger ones. The way Grandpa had tried to protect him not from consequences, but from shame. He admitted he had failed. He had covered too much, forgiven too easily, and in doing so had let silence rot the spaces where honesty should have lived. At the end he wrote, "We do not help the ones we love by hiding their failures. We help them by forcing them to face them. And we help ourselves by not letting their damage become ours." I didn't speak for a long time after finishing the letter. The words pressed against my chest like a slow, steady weight. He reached toward the side table and pulled out a second envelope. One more thing. It was a copy of a newly notarized will. The assets were to be divided evenly between me and Chloe. But there was a condition. Chloe would receive her half only if she agreed to co-direct a new nonprofit foundation we would build together, the George Miller Foundation. Its mission to provide safe housing for women who had been financially or emotionally abused by their families. I held the papers in my hands, stunned. This wasn't about inheritance. This was about direction. He wasn't giving us money. He was giving us responsibility. "I thought it should go to the two of you," he said quietly. "Not because you're perfect, but because you know what it means to rebuild." I called Chloe later that night. She came over in a hoodie and jeans, hair still wet from a shower. I handed her the letter and sat beside her while she read. When she reached the end, she wiped at her eyes. "I always thought I was just the shadow," she said, "the one who didn't see the truth in time. But this feels like someone finally believes I can help fix what was broken." She looked up at me. "I want to do it. I want to be part of something that doesn't start with hiding." We didn't hug. We didn't cry. We just nodded. The kind of nod that comes after silence, after the need to win or defend, fades into the need to build something better. That night, I stayed at Grandpa's house long after Chloe had left. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. I sat by his side, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, letting the weight of years lift off my shoulders one quiet second at a time. I knew this was the end of one chapter, and the beginning of something I could finally call mine. 1 month later, Harper Court opened its doors. It wasn't a glossy ribbon cutting with cameras and officials. It was quiet. A few families with plastic bags and strollers. A toddler who ran down the hall barefoot and shrieked with joy at his new bedroom. A woman who cried when she saw a lock that worked, and a bathroom without mold. I stood inside one of the model units, the morning sun pouring through the oversized windows, touching the floor like a promise. It was everything I never had, and everything I now got to give. That evening, I hosted a small gathering on my balcony in Lodo. Chloe came early and brought lemonade. Mom arrived with a plate of lemon bars she'd baked herself. Grandpa, now in a wheelchair, was helped up the elevator by one of the contractors I'd hired for the Harper Court build. A few neighbors and new residents from the project joined us. Nothing fancy, just fairy lights, paper plates, and a table full of fresh fruit and cheese. In my hand was a folder of early sketches for the next project. A building designed for single mothers with young children, each unit crafted with both safety and dignity in mind. I showed it to Grandpa. Ooh. He smiled, squeezed my hand, and whispered, "You're doing exactly what you were meant to." While guests chatted and music played from someone's phone, I checked my email. There was a new message. No subject line, just a name in the sender field that made my stomach turn. My father. The email was only one sentence long. You win. But remember, everyone has a reason for who they become. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then hit print. I folded the page, slowly slipped it into an envelope, and walked over to the candle flickering in the middle of the table. Without a word, I held the envelope over the flame until the edges blackened, then dropped it into the glass bowl where it crumbled to ash. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel grief. I felt the absence of his voice in my head, like a door finally closing after years of creaking open at every weak moment. Forgiveness wasn't something I owed him. It was something I reclaimed for myself. Later, as the sun dipped behind the Denver skyline, I stepped onto the edge of the balcony. Chloe stood beside me, her arms resting on the railing. "Do you still hate him?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "But I don't let that hate decide what I build anymore." She smiled. "Me neither." We clinked our glasses, lemonade, no champagne, and stood in silence as the sky deepened into blue. The horizon stretched wide, unbroken. If someone ever asked me where I grew up, I'd tell them the truth. In a basement. But that's not where I live anymore, and it never will be again. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones fought in silence, inside families, inside ourselves. Healing doesn't always come with closure, but it begins when we choose truth over comfort, purpose over pride, and light over legacy. If this story spoke to you, share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear from you. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. Your support truly means everything.